All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I know that this is the last session of the day, but thank you so much for making the time to come and listen to our panel discussion here, getting to hear from some of the most committed people who are at the coalface of supporting the fintech ecosystems as enablers of this ecosystem in their own right. Going into our first question, I think a key theme that's come across in the conference today and some of the conversations is really around the work that clearly needs to be done regarding shifting perceptions of the local and continental fintech ecosystem, right? And given that you guys are really in the cold face of the work, you guys see the startups, you guys see the innovations that come through your channels all the time. I would like for you to share just one highlight, right? One highlight that you think that you think demonstrates the strength of the African fintech ecosystem and that we can actually use to teach other ecosystems because we are our own strength. So, John, you are looking directly at me, and I also heard you made quite an impact in one of the other sessions that you were in. So I'm going to go first to you and ask you.
I was looking at you, I guess. Okay. I think for me, I grew up in Europe. I grew up in Dublin, so I'm a Black Irishman. Just for the record. But it's interesting. In one of the things I learned since I moved back to Africa since 2017 was the value of non-regulation or very limited regulation in the continent, which is where the whole opportunity for innovation lies for the fintech companies and the ones who've been successful. You've seen they've literally leveraged off very, loosely regulated market that then became, and overly over-regulation later on catching on to do different things. But the one of the opportunities that I think the fintech industry, as an ecosystem player, is how do you create multiple market opportunities for this country's companies. So I'll give you an example. We're in Kenya. The fintech market there is extremely competitive for new young fintech company that comes up. One, they don't have money, they don't, just lots of other things. But it's a great idea. The idea makes sense, it works. It can actually scale, it can actually build a business. And the first thing is really not worrying about, am I going to get funded or not? Okay, let's forget that, throw that out of the table. Can you actually build a commercially viable business? Even if you don't get funded for the next 5 years, can you actually build a business that would actually hire people, make money, and actually work? All right, so maybe Kenya is a really difficult market for you. So what we do as a studio is we go to Zambia, and because we're also building our network, so I'm building the largest rail network in the continent because I want to build my studio in 25 countries so I can scale a business easily anywhere at speed. So I take that same business that is in Kenya, still trying to figure out how it will compete with all the big players, and I took it to Zambia, and the next day is making money because the market is much younger. But that same business would never have been able to go to Zambia by itself. So it's a brand new company. It's less than 6, 7, 8 months old. But I've taken it to Zambia. I've registered it. I've helped it get a license. And I've given it its first customer. And now it's making money. And on day 2, day 3 to investors, it becomes more valuable. But I have scaled in traffic and trade because effectively the opportunity for that company might not necessarily just be in Kenya. So why basically say just only because you here, you have to survive here? Kenya might just be your prototype. And the opportunity lies for you in Zambia, the opportunity lies for you in the DRC, but the fragmented nature of this continent makes it extremely difficult, except you have a lot of money or so many other people. So, and obviously the banks also don't make it easy for you at the same time in places like South Africa, where they make it extremely difficult for you to actually try to scale anything. So that's one. Then also then being able to teach them how to actually do matchmaking rather than disruption. So once you use other words like, why don't the fintech become your last mile partner? There's no need for them to disrupt you. You've done all this work for years to build all this ecosystem. Let's drop that word. Why not just match a fintech to help you finish that part that you cannot get to, that township that you don't want to go to? A fintech company can just do it for you. And then you both make money. And they don't have to worry about rebuilding the whole ecosystem that you've created. So rethinking logically about how relationships actually work could also help fintech. So when you do those things and you scale this company, we've just scaled one of our companies, Ecoba, from a market where they were still struggling with everybody else to another market where they're now making money and they haven't raised any money and they're going to another market again where they're about to. And it's only because as an ecosystem provider, we do the painful work. We do all the hard work for them so that they can actually scale their business. Then on day 2, day 3, and then what then happens is even when they come back to Kenya, they can still compete without having to raise any money. So for me, that is really the success story of being an ecosystem player, because I don't just look at what you're doing here now. And in the final, and if you think about why I talked about Ireland in the first place, was growing up in Ireland, my first startup was in Dublin. I never sold one thing in Ireland. All my clients were in the UK, but I was in Dublin. So I could have failed, but I exited my company. So if somebody had told me the same philosophy that if I don't sell in Ireland, I can't build a successful business. This is the opportunity, is opportunity Africa. That's what everybody else is talking about. Until we really see opportunity Africa for the fintech industry, then we begin to connect all the different dots.
Great, thanks for that, John. So you're saying opportunity Africa, really reflecting on that mindset shift that we actually also need to be able to grow some of our fintechs. Nev, you have not learned the lesson from John. You are looking directly at me. You are next. So I want to hear from you. You know, what are the transferable lessons and what is one transferable highlight from your experience supporting startups in the fintech ecosystem that we can teach to other global ecosystems?
I really liked your answer, and I think a lot of it's around collaboration. So I think I did some travel in this year, and I spent some time traveling across East Africa. So I went to Kenya, went to Rwanda, went to Uganda, and I think one of the things that we're missing out on as an African continent is, even at a regulatory level, being able to collaborate amongst the regulators, because each one is doing their own thing. And it was actually quite shocking for me. I was in a North African country. I'm not going to mention which one it was. And I was told by them that, no, we are part of Europe and we are a geological event away from being part of Europe. And I said, but you're not Africa. It's on the world map, I'm pretty sure. And they said, no, we part there and then we follow like an EU type regulation. So to copy and paste these businesses and move them across is very difficult. Whereas if you look at the EU, it becomes very easy because you've got the same sort of legal framework that's there. But that being said, one of the things that I took as a definite positive, so we hosted an event where we were able to get a couple of the regulators across East Africa all together and start collaborating together, not because of anything else, and said, listen, the problems you are all facing are exactly the same in your countries because your economies are the same, the types of people you've got are the same, they're larger and smaller. And I think some of the movements like to sort of align all of the regulation across the East African countries is definitely a step in the right direction. We always talk about one Africa, and I think the fragmentation of Africa in terms of regulation, technology, connectivity is something that's really holding back Africa from going ahead, because that captivated audience of 1.5 billion, we can't get to all of them because you need to copy, paste, cut a little bit out, copy, paste, and it becomes incredibly difficult to scale. So I think that's the biggest thing, is that collaboration doesn't need to be done formally. You can do it informally and still achieve the same results, and don't let the process get you down. We need to take control of it and make the change that we want to see. And I think it is possible.
Okay. Sorry, technical response. Okay, sorry to break up from the panel. Just I need to mention that we have 2 more panels. There's cryptocurrency's future in this room and fintech's role in e-commerce in the main room, just for anyone who is confused. But back to our panel. Okay, so I love the highlights that you shared, and Nev, I think you specifically touched on something that I find close to my heart in terms of bringing the Africanness right into anything we're trying to solve. And that idea of collaboration really lends to Ubuntu and humanity, right? So I think that's something that we can definitely leverage, especially in the more global and slightly more individualized societies, right? To actually leverage that cultural asset. So you guys are really pushing me in the direction of regulation, right? So I'm going to switch the gears a little bit, and then I'm going to call on our public sector representative. Disclaimer, Diteho is not speaking on behalf of anyone, on the president.
Thank you, Boka.
I just wanted to get that out of the way for you. But what I do want to ask you, you are part of the government's war room. I'm interested to know what it is that you think the role of government is in the enablement of the fintech ecosystem, and even share a little bit, whatever it is you are privy to, in terms of what types of initiatives the war room, from a regulatory perspective, is maybe trying to push in order to advance the ecosystem that we can maybe, share with other ecosystems. So really the role of government in the regulatory process.
Thanks for that question. And it's been really interesting today just being in the room with the Reserve Bank and the Financial Services Conduct Authority and the work that they're doing around regulatory work in the space. Just from an enabling point of view, in the war room, we established and promulgated the Township Economic Development Act in Gauteng, which is a critical enabler for investment within the townships to grow the economies of township areas. And we, so one of the biggest takeaways that we have from the exercise of the war room is just how many fintechs are actually in townships and the amazing work that they're doing, and the lack of access to financing and funding that they have. And what they've done is they've solved for themselves and clustered together in order to form formalized structures. So we saw that through Fever Tree and through with the retail clustering, and then through the Indu group, which is basically taking your backyard dwellers in different areas in the townships, in the back room of shacks, and really upskilling, building it up to access levels of credit and loans from your formalized structures. So the traditional financing structures within the country, but what we've seen basically in Gauteng is that even though South African banks generate the highest numbers of non-interest revenue around the world, they don't service the majority of our people. And fintech really can play a huge impact in really, solving for that big crisis. So the role of the Gauteng provincial government in that regard is we've created a township economic partnership fund, where it's a blended finance arrangement, and we are desperately looking for decentralized financing, fintech investors to come in and give us, your non-TradFi investments within this unknown, for lack of a better word, group of fintech startups, fintech young people who have clustered themselves but have no one to invest in the areas. And the focus of the Gauteng provincial government within our townships is we'd like to stop seeing our people leave the townships and work in suburban areas. We want to have the townships developed in an environment where you live in a township, you work in a township, you play in the township. So we've reinvigorated our state properties within townships so that they can be those areas and workstations, and just refocusing investment into the townships so that we see the great potential of economic growth and development that the townships have, and have it grow to levels where we are actually creating a unicorn in townships. How great would that be to have a township unicorn in South Africa? I think if we could do that, Jacques, he's my DDG there, we would have definitely disrupted a system that desperately needs to focus back into townships and to focus on the people that really are innovating, people that are on the ground doing the work and solving for themselves. I think if we could, walk away with some ideas from colleagues in the room within the space who do decentralized financing, DOAs, NFTs, anything like that could help us in growing our township economic development zones, that would be much appreciated. Thanks.
That's brilliant, because I think I love how you are framing the role of government as, starting to develop some of the gaps that may be there in terms of the support of being inclusive to all kinds of fintechs, right? And all kinds of fintech markets and underserved fintechs in those areas in order to reinvigorate those economies. So I absolutely love that. And I think that goal of a unicorn from the township is brilliant. I love that. And I'm curious to hear from you, Jonathan first, and then I'll also pose the same question to Louis. So we've heard, kind of Ditejo's take on what kind of an additional role or the additionality that the role of government can actually entail when it comes to supporting the fintech ecosystem. But still on that, line of regulation, from an investment advisory perspective, which is the scope that you play in, what kind of incentives do you feel would benefit people kind of on the investor side from the government perspective to actually boost this ecosystem?
That's a great question. Actually, Nigeria just put a startup bill that went live, which I think is really good.
A couple of weeks ago.
And it has some very good, I guess, facilitation capabilities in it, where capital comes in. There's no capital gains tax and things like that. If I can twist the question a little bit,
yeah.
I guess for me, how can the government support these entrepreneurs to live? Right? We're talking about startups and all this stuff, and going from 0 to 1 and doing something, but they still need to live, and they're still under the pressures, and having the local governments, organizations, angel networks being able to help relieve some of those pressures, so that the entrepreneurs can focus on doing something extraordinary. I think that's probably more key than regulation right now. That would be my suggestion. Happy to hear what anyone else thinks.
I love that, because that's putting a real twist, but a real live one, right, on the idea of incentives, because we think of incentives from an enabler perspective, a financier perspective, but it's like, how do we actually create incentives for the entrepreneurs themselves who have the ideas and the innovations that make the impact, right? Thank you for that, Louis. I see your kind of mic getting hot there. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to kind of pull it to a point, like you mentioned, like how to build a township unicorn, right? I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done around aligning who in the ecosystem is doing what. So what I mean by that is effectively when you look at like what can only government do, it's kind of like that, like management saying, where like what can only you do to solve the problem, right? And like if we use South Africa as an example, I think one of the biggest challenges that there is like mainly a lot of uncertainty around IP, right, and where it's being created. And unfortunately, most of the ventures that I actually see from a South African perspective at some point are trying to offshore something in some way. And I think what that actually does, it's actually kind of a little bit more complex about how I think it actually is holding back building a township unicorn. Because I think one of the things that's really great about ecosystems that I think is not spoken about enough is success cases, right? So if you look in Europe, and I think we're kind of well positioned to kind of, I guess, compare the two markets or two regions, right? In Europe, like the role of successful companies like, a WeFox, like unicorns that have built huge customer bases properly, what you end up seeing is that they end up seeding a large base of other people who are going to get there as well. Because it's the learning, it's the experience, it's knowing what to do, when to do it, those kind of things. And having been in the business while it happened. And I think you're starting to see it in the African market a lot more with companies making it, like the Paystacks, like the Flutterwaves, right? And people who then leave there actually have seen the blueprint and how it works. And each country is slightly different, right? But what happens is if you have your success cases who could make it, and they're ending up moving off because of the fact that there is uncertainty, even uncertainty, right? If you look at like European VCs trying to write tickets into South African venture, other jurisdictions are different. You'll see the amount of DD that's going through for them to even understand what is exchange control, right? And that takes another 2 months on a raise, which is really tough, right? So I think what actually we need to do is figure out if government is going to support on some of these, like what is the only 1 or 2 things that we can get through and quickly? Because I would argue, I mean, you can look at it many ways, but you could argue that trying to bring investors into new ventures in certain areas under certain technologies are things that would happen naturally if you did the bedrock work. So if that was clearer and we did the work to make sure that that uncertainty was handled, I think the rest of the ecosystem could take over a little bit of that, right? Because investors are looking for these opportunities. So if we, I guess it's a roundabout answer, but if we manage to keep more success cases that made that unicorn, even if they're just not in that particular industry, like a Yoko is a great example, right? All the stuff they're doing now, I mean, obviously they have like a large team here, but they are based for all intents and purposes in the Netherlands, and they're building teams there, right? And like we lose that ability to feed that back in. So I would say that like we should align on what is the one or two things. And I think the mention of a startup kind of act is kind of apt, right? But the question is like, how quickly can we get it done? And like, there's lots we could do. We could do all of it, and we could really spend a lot of time like doing a lot of these things. But I think it's which piece do we unlock first, and then allow the ecosystem to kick off, because it's constrained at the moment. I'm using South Africa as an example, but other African countries have similar versions of it, right? So I think that's kind of what I would say about the regulation case.
Thanks for that, Louis. So what I'm hearing from you is that we should really try to prioritize what it is that government can do, but what is the most impactful things of the laundry list that sits before government, because we know that there is a lot on the plate. And so you drive me into the next sort of angle that I want the conversation to take, which is really around as ecosystem enablers, right? I think the fintech ecosystem has been around for quite a while, and so have enablers, but the ecosystem has evolved. So I'm curious, as enablers, how do you think our role, firstly, do you think our role has evolved enough alongside the development of the ecosystem? But then how do you see our role evolving in future? And do we have a role in the fintech ecosystem of the future? John.
I wasn't looking at you this time.
I've got to keep you guessing, got to keep you on your toes.
I think the ecosystem players and ecosystem is a word that people use a lot, but I can't still find a better word to use yet, so I'll stay with that.
Yeah.
I think it's a very important, especially in markets where you don't generate the money. We don't generate the money. The money comes from somewhere else. A lot of the things we need come from somewhere else. This is why ecosystems are and the evolution of those ecosystems. I went to startup bootcamp when I was early in 2009 in Europe. That's the first ecosystem I ever participated in when I was building my first startup. And it was a different type of ecosystem. It was very specific. But I think in Africa, ecosystem players like this have to do a lot more work. Because one, we have more people coming into the fintech space, a lot more young people waking up every day and saying, I want to run a fintech company. And the size of the pie that exists is still extremely limited. We have limited angel investors. We have limited VCs from Africa who are not driven by international standards. So we can't make our own standards. All the standards are set separately. So all the things that these startups need, and also we need to teach them a little bit, especially in the fintech space, is one, you need resources. Like she said, they need to eat.
Yeah.
So you need to create, different decentralized models that allow you to actually create value in each of their lifestyles. That actually allow you to sustain their lifestyles as well, while they can focus on the things they need to do. Then you also then need to say, okay, they need talent. Talent is very expensive in Africa, getting more expensive every day. How do you participate in creating collaborative shared talent ecosystems for them that can still allow them to, even without finance, so you have to take away finance, for example, they don't get finance. How do we still build enough fintechs? So it is really true, the ecosystem play that and then collaborative efforts that you can actually show them, but you have to go one step further. You actually also have to participate in finding them those opportunities so that they can also knock on those doors without necessarily having to say, there's a thing recently as I finished where people talk a lot about mentorship of this ecosystem, and I say, you should scrap that word completely and never mention it again and just matchmake people. Matchmake. If you really want to support someone, go all the way, matchmake them, open that door for them, call that guy in Pick and Pay, say, hey, go help this guy. This is what we're going to do. Don't just mentor me and leave me on the street and I'm still hanging.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So yes, we do have a
Cool.
big role to play going forward, an evolution of our role.
Thank you for that, John. And I guess it's good news for all of us because it means that we'll still be in jobs. But in closing the panel, I know that I'm out of time, but I just want to ask one final question, which will take 30 seconds each person, I promise. Okay, 15. You guys heard the time police. Okay. So one last question. If you each had a billboard with a call to action, if you're given the rights to a billboard to write a short, succinct call to action after the discussion that we've had, or something that's really been pressing you in terms of the work that we're doing, what would it be? I will start with you, Nev, even though you were looking away. Remember, guys, 15 seconds.
I think I would go for, I think Africa's problems need African solutions. Let's come together as one Africa and solve it all together.
Love that. John, you're next.
I would go for a sign that says, please collaborate.
Louis.
Jeez.
Come on, Louis, we're
Not-
banking
not-
on you.
Not much of a billboard writer. Yeah, like I still feel the same way about entrepreneurship in both regions. Like you actually just have to get stuck into the problem, identify what we need to fix, get stuck in, get it done. That's pretty much it.
I love it. And Ditsejo, no pressure. Last but
This is
not least.
big pressure from government, but I think I'm going to just use John's collaboration call to action, because even though government is working on a Startup Act in South Africa, and we have initiatives happening within our Township Economic Development Act and Township Partnership Fund, we really need all the players within the space to come to the table and assist government to get into a space where we could have the enabling elements that Louis was talking about. So collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. Assist government to
Yeah.
assist you to do the job better, and help us to financially include the people that need it most in this country. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. So in order to get one Africa, we need to collaborate, and everyone just needs to do it and do their part. Thank you, everyone.